Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you everybody for listening to this talk. It's always a pleasure to get to share some of what we've been working on. So my name is Lejeune, and I've been an assistant professor at Boston University in the Mechanical Engineering Department since January 2020. And this is a photo of my research group with PhD students Saeed, Hiba, Kwan, Lingzhao, and Jeffrey. And today I'm going to present a part of the work done by our group. And in particular, I'm going to highlight a project that Saeed has worked on and a project that Ling Zhao has been working on in collaboration with my colleague here at BU Herald Park. So in our group, we do work that ranges essentially from mechanical modeling methods all the way over to computational image analysis. And in general, we're really interested in this workflow of large data sets to curated data to computational models. And right now, we're working on a few big picture topics. So mechanical data analysis, so the sort of mechanics machine learning crossover, which is most of what I'm going to talk about today. Biomechanical image analysis, so really curating data from images and movies of these biological systems. And then also fundamental mechanics research applied to biological cells and tissue. So before getting into the heart of this presentation, where I'm going to focus on my work at sort of the mechanics machine learning crossover, I just want to show a couple snapshots of some of the other work my group is doing, essentially to point out the direction that we plan to evolve in the future, where our goal is really to create these multi-scale models of biological tissues that are informed by experimental data that is collected at scale. So on this slide, I'm showing some work that we've done as part of an engineering research center here at BU. Specifically, we're interested in extracting information from images and movies of human-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cardiomyocytes. And really just sort of very big picture, we're a small part of a much larger project where the goal is to really be able to use this human-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived cardiomyocyte technology to create patient-specific engineered heart tissue and also understand patient-specific drug response. And our role has been focused on developing software to essentially curate data from these experiments. And this is interesting to us because these cells have a pretty nonlinear structure, and they're also very mechanically active cells. So we've been really focused on trying to pull out metrics that describe morphology and function as a key part of kind of interpreting these experiments and trying to understand how to turn these sort of experimental data sets into effective and predictive computational models. So on this lower row, we show a schematic of the sarcomeres in these cells. These are these fluorescently labeled striations. And you can see on this slide that these cells are contracting, and we can develop tools to essentially track those fluorescently labeled components and kind of conceptualize these cells as graph structures, which will let us pull out information from them to feed into computational models down the line. And again, this is just kind of a snapshot of something that we're working on and trying to understand heterogeneous materials. Here's another example that moves up one spatial scale, where we have an ongoing project with a collaborator here at BU, Jeroen Eijkmans, where essentially we're focusing on applying similar computational image analysis techniques to experiments at the microtissue scale. So here's an example related to wound healing. And then we also have a collaboration that moves up another spatial scale, an ongoing project with Chad Hovey at Sentia. This time we're looking at whole organs. And really, I'm just showing these project snapshots to give sort of examples of the types of biological data that we're interested in. There's complex geometry, emergent nonlinear phenomena, extreme heterogeneity, uncertainty, and really these sort of big picture problems are in the back of our heads as we work on methods for applying machine learning to problems in mechanics. So the lower row of images on the slide shows some generic examples of the heterogeneity that exists in biological materials. And really being able to effectively model and understand this heterogeneity is a key part of making advances in this area. And for the main focus of this talk, I'm going to discuss work that's essentially kind of in the second half of this big picture pipeline that we're interested in, which is going from curated data over to computational models. So with that brief introduction of the types of problems that we're interested in and sort of where we want to go with this work in terms of trying to make predictive models that are focused on these very spatially heterogeneous materials, I'm going to bring us to this concept that's illustrated right on this slide that I'm sure some people are quite familiar with, where the idea is that we want to use machine learning to more effectively simulate heterogeneous materials and access, these massive parameter spaces that are associated with heterogeneous materials. So on this slide, I just show a schematic description of metamodels or models of models that are constructed by training a machine learning model on a database of simulation results. And what this allows us to do is take model inputs. So in this example, material property distributions or descriptors of geometry, and then use them in a machine learning based kind of framework to predict fixed quantities of interest at a fraction of the computational costs of whole finite element simulations. And again, since we're interested in these spatially heterogeneous materials, this becomes a really useful tool for exploring larger parameter spaces, but then also kind of more big picture, as we curate these experimental data sets, we're going to try to take some of these same sort of machine learning methods we're sort of figuring out on these in this meta model context and apply that to some other projects. But thinking about meta models, they really become an essential tool when you want to do things that require a high number of simulation runs. So that could be multi-scale modeling, material design optimization, uncertainty quantification and sensitivity analysis, real-time prediction, data integration, and much, much more than that. This slide shows a few nice examples from the literature. And there's really, so much more that I could have put on this slide. I originally made it in 2020, and I feel like the field has just continued to grow ever since then. But one thing that is interesting to me, or perhaps maybe concerning, is that despite all of this recent work in developing metamodels for heterogeneous materials or metamodels for mechanical systems, there isn't necessarily a clear picture of what types or architectures of metamodels will work best on engineering mechanics relevant data. So to solve a given problem, there's so many different types of models to choose from, and within each model type, there's so many different choices for model architecture and hyperparameters. We want to be able to do things to kind of overcome this kind of lack of collective knowledge in the fields. And one potential way to overcome this is to look at other fields, for example, computer vision, where benchmark data sets have had a massive impact, both in showcasing new methods, but also in motivating future research directions. So two of the most popular examples are shown here. ImageNet, a collection of hand-labeled images, and MNS, which is a collection of labeled handwritten digits. And the thing that's kind of important to point out here is that the barrier to entry for working with these data sets is super low. You can download MNIST in 2 lines of code. And these data sets make it quite straightforward to compare different machine learning models through their benchmark performance. And one area that my group has been thinking a lot about over the past couple of years is the question, can we contribute something similar for mechanics? Or maybe even more generally, what collective advances are needed in order to have something similar for the mechanics community? And with this setup, I just want to spend a couple of slides talking about what we see as the broader motivation for creating benchmark data sets for mechanics. And I'll also say that this is something we've been thinking about a lot, but it's also a topic that we approach very humbly and sort of acknowledge that it's going to require a much more kind of like collective research community action besides what one lab can do. So with that in mind, here's sort of the philosophy behind what we've been thinking about. So one thing that we really are motivated to do is to try and design benchmark data sets for the purpose of both education and research dissemination. So as I mentioned previously, one large benefit of benchmark data sets for computer vision is that it makes it much easier to get started with learning how to apply machine learning methods. Having something similar for mechanics would be really great, right? It would be an educational tool. And it also would make it easier to disseminate kind of new results. And, I come from a computational mechanics background. I think that there's some sort of analogy between developing benchmark problems for machine learning and standard things like patch tests or Cook's membrane that people use to debug or demonstrate really the efficacy of novel finite element technology. So the second big picture motivation that we're really thinking about is what I alluded to before, which is that there's many different machine learning models and methods to choose from and adapt to new classes of data. And really access to benchmark data sets for mechanics could help us to gain that collective knowledge where we can compare between different methods in a more reproducible way. And I think this is something that could be useful to people who, are trying to develop new methods in the fields and want to show that their methods are effective, but also really interesting or potentially useful for people who have an application that they care about and want to just know which method they should be picking up and using to accomplish their goals. And then the third sort of big picture motivation that we've been thinking about a lot, I think this concept is sort of particularly important for things such as physics-informed neural networks or related topics. It's this idea that mechanical data, in some ways, is special, right? Mechanics data sets have the potential to motivate new method development, and I just think there's something really exciting about that. What can we as a mechanics community put forward in terms of thoughtfully curated data sets to motivate new methodological development? And I've structured sort of the remainder of my talk around little snapshots of these three broad concepts. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that my group is doing in each one of these areas. And this slide here just shows sort of a snapshot of the benchmark data sets that my students and I have been curating and disseminating over the past 3 years or so. And I'll touch on a few of the examples shown here. But before I get started and really showing my own research, I want to point out that like I said before, this is by necessity really a broader community endeavor. I recently had the opportunity to write a blog post on the website iMechanica about this topic. There are a lot of insightful comments that were posted beyond what I wrote that I think are really worth checking out. And I'm also working on a website that essentially just links to open access data sets curated by others. So if you have something that you think I should add to this list, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And you can see from this list, we already have a pretty diverse selection of data sets, well beyond what one lab could be responsible for. So coming back to these three larger areas, let's start by thinking about this concept of benchmark data sets primarily for education and making it easy to get sort of hands-on experience with machine learning algorithms through the lens of mechanics. So on this slide, I show kind of an introduction to the mechanical MNS data set. It's a data set that my group has been working on, and it's a data set for regression problems in mechanics. And it's sort of a play or a direct inspiration from the MNS data set of handwritten digits from the computer vision community. And just sort of as an aside, right, we did this because this data set is well known, but it's also a really nice size data set. It's small enough to download on any modern computer with a standard Wi-Fi connection, but it's also large enough to meaningfully train neural networks, which I think is really important for sort of being useful in this area. And what we do here is we convert the 70,000 images to 70,000 simulations of a neo-Hookean material with varying modulus, where the digit is a high modulus material embedded in a low modulus matrix. And then we run simulations where we deform the block of material. And you can see examples here, right? The stiff digit influences how the entire domain deforms. And then for each 28 by 28 bitmap, we report full field displacements, total change in strain energy, and then total reaction force at multiple steps of applied displacement. And we conduct all of these simulations with the open source library Phoenix. Our code is freely available. And if you Google it, it should be straightforward to find and download yourself. And sort of since this kind of original idea with neo-Hookean materials, we have also branched out in multiple directions. We have multiple load cases, the fashion MNIST pattern, different simulation fidelity levels, an example with phase field fracture. And we've just been progressively advancing, expanding the scope, sort of motivated by the machine learning algorithms we've been interested in developing. And like I said before, these are all hosted on an open source repository, the OpenBU institutional repository. And we've tried our best to really include additional information that makes them easier to work with. So in addition to this kind of, this initial sort of MNIST data set that's shown on the previous slide, we've also been really trying to explore examples where it might not necessarily be straightforward to adapt kind of broader concepts from the machine learning literature to mechanics problems. And I'm just showing sort of a couple of examples on this slide right here, where we're looking at things like material nonlinearity, or also kind of complex architectures that aren't necessarily amenable to being treated as image-like data. So what I'm going to talk about now is just this initial example right here, where we want to do full field prediction. So if we look at the computer vision literature, there's a bunch of algorithms that are very effective for something called semantic segmentation, where essentially you want to say what every pixel in an image belongs to, right? You can see a car or a street right here. We want to see if we can adapt those algorithms to do kind of the analogous thing for mechanical data, where we're predicting full field displacements or full field phase field fracture. And when we initially became interested in this problem, my graduate student, Saeed, ended up essentially looking over at the computer vision research area and noticing that units were a really popular technique right there. And if you look at this slide right here, what you can see is that if we take a unit and apply it to our fashion MNS data set, you get this histogram of error, and you can keep the number kind of 5% error in your head, maybe 4.5% error in your head. And you can also look at this example comparing the predictions to the ground truth for the worst case examples. And you can see that potentially there's something that to be desired. We really felt motivated to see if we could try to do better here. And ultimately, what Saeed ended up doing was designing a meta-model architecture that we refer to as the multi-res WNet. It's illustrated on this slide, and it's essentially two multi-resolution unit blocks in series. They form this W shape, combined with depthwise separable convolutions. And this architecture is a modification to the standard unit architecture that replaces the sequence of regular convolutions by these multi-resolution convolutional blocks, and passes the encoded output at each level through a convolutional residual path before concatenating to this upsample tensor. And these changes, in sort of a hand-wavy way, we think made it easier for the meta model to extract features at different levels of zoom, which is important for mechanics problems where both global, local, and intermediate scale features are important to consider. And we've posted the related code on GitHub for anyone who's interested. And then on this slide right here, we show a direct comparison to the UNet example from the computer vision literature, which we're initially dissatisfied with. So you can see this UNet example here, again, about 4.5% error in comparison to this multi-res WNet, which is our code right here, where we have around 1% error. And what's interesting too is that in addition to looking at the average performance, we can also look at these worst case scenario performances right here. So comparing the red markers to the gray markers, and we can see that the multi-res WNet is really quite effective. On this slide, we show some additional visualizations of the multi-res WNet performance. So here we're starting with full field displacement predictions in a hyperelastic material. And really, Saeed, when he was figuring out the architecture for this multi-res WNet, this is sort of the key example that we're looking at. We had 4 data sets within the mechanical MNS collection, and we get kind of these nice results. If you look at the histograms on the slide, you can see that across different load cases, so uniaxial extension, equibiaxial extension, both for mechanical MNS and mechanical MNS fashion, we see absolute percentage error below 1%. And really, our predictions are very close to being perfect. You kind of have to zoom in right here to see the difference between our predictions and the ground truth. And we sort of were looking at this and we're thinking, okay, we need to design a harder problem to really challenge our model. So that's what we ended up doing right here. We created the mechanical MNS crack path data set, where we convert the fashion MNS bitmaps into a material with heterogeneous inclusions, and then run these linear elastic phase field model simulations where each bitmap led to a unique crack path. And we set up this problem with these kind of strange loading conditions because it gave us a good balance between diversity in the data set, so the crack paths don't all necessarily look alike, but also implementation feasibility. And just like our other data sets, this one's freely available for download and includes these full field damage fields along with the force and displacement curves that are shown here for each geometry. And again, anyone who's interested, please feel free to check it out. And before I show you kind of the performance on this data set, I just want to note briefly that we're going to use the F1 score, which ignores the true negative pixels. The formula here is defined on these slides. And you can see in these images, really this error metric is necessary because otherwise the background true negative pixels will dominate the result. So here we show how the multi-res WNet performs on the mechanical MNS crackpath dataset. We're able to achieve an F1 score of 0.87 on the test dataset. And for context, we also compute how many examples predict continuous crack paths, where errors often look more like these kind of plausible alternative paths that a crack could take, where there's sort of an initial wrong decision about avoiding an occlusion, and then the incorrect predictions, which have both low F1 scores and discontinuous paths. And we applied kind of some qualitative grouping to these results as well. And in the end, we ended up considering about 79% of our predictions correct, where you really have to zoom in to see the difference between our meta model predictions and the ground truth. But there's also definitely room kind of for improvement here, where we think there's really motivation for other people to use this data set to try to develop methods that can beat the performance shown here. And just very quickly, this slide also shows some preliminary work looking at ensembles of crackpath predictions. If we initialize neural network training, in some cases we get subtly different answers or different predictions. And what's really cool is that we can make an ensemble of these predictions and use them to get a more accurate solution. And we want to sort of understand a little bit better how we can extract more information about uncertainty from this data. And that's really something that we're working on still. So far, we've discussed a bit about developing benchmark data sets for education and dissemination. We've also discussed leveraging machine learning methods to make predictions on mechanical data. And then sort of for the rest of this talk, I'm going to focus on a couple of examples where we think problems in mechanics could specifically motivate new machine learning model development. And really, this is kind of a very rich area. My group has been working on a very tiny slice of it. So just as a setup for our motivation behind this problem, for a standard supervised learning problem, we can train a convolutional neural network to predict strain energy at a fixed supply displacement from an initial input bitmap. And from this graph, where we essentially plot mean absolute percent test error on the y-axis and the number of training samples on the x-axis, we can see that we get excellent performance when there are tens of thousands of available training examples. Of course, when there are only hundreds or thousands training examples, the meta model performance is not great. And we're really in this region where we want to be adding more training data. And the problem is that often for the actual applications we're interested in, we're modeling spatially heterogeneous materials. We're often in this area where we really would want more data. We're in this kind of area of diminishing returns. And we can be stuck in this region for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we clearly want more training data because generating these data is prohibitively expensive. Or it could also be that these data are really experimentally hard to acquire, and it would just be completely unrealistic to anticipate getting this many training samples. So one potential way to overcome this is to leverage low fidelity data sets that are much cheaper to acquire. And this is an area that a lot of people have referred to essentially as multifidelity modeling. For a mechanical MNS data set, here's what these different simulations fidelities end up looking like. On the upper row, we have our high fidelity simulations with fully refined meshes, quadratic elements, and a 3D example. On the lower row, we have meshes of various coarseness with linear elements, and then simulations where the applied displacement is just a perturbation, so a fraction of the percentage displacement of our full fidelity simulations. And you can basically see simulation times here range from fractions of a second for perturbation simulations on this coarse mesh to tens of minutes for our 3D simulations. And all of these simulations are conducted in Phoenix, which is not necessarily the fastest code, but the important part here to remember is that our high fidelity simulations can be orders of magnitude more expensive to run than our lower fidelity simulations. So just as kind of a brief example, again, kind of like a snapshot of the work that we've been doing, we can use this broad concept of transfer learning, which describes the practice of leveraging the knowledge gained while solving one problem, so in this case, low fidelity simulation, to solve a different related problem, in this case, high fidelity simulation. On this slide, we show a schematic for how we conduct transfer learning, just with really straightforward model pre-training. And in PyTorch, it's important to note this can be implemented in one line of code. And here we essentially use our course mesh simulations to pre-train the model. And then we perform additional training on our high fidelity data set. And this plot right here shows test error on the y-axis, a number of high fidelity simulations used for training on the x-axis. The black ever curve shows what model performance would look like with no pre-training. And then each one of these other curves shows a different number of low fidelity simulations used for training. And you can see here with the point that's circled in blue, where we have just 100 high fidelity simulations, we can achieve a comparable test error to the meta model trained with 60,000 full fidelity simulations. And to me, this is interesting, essentially, because running 60,000 high fidelity simulations would definitely require some sort of supercomputer, whereas the combination of 60,000 low fidelity simulations with 100 high fidelity simulations, it's something that you could hypothetically do on your laptop if you're decently patient. So developing machine learning methods that are tailored to multi-fidelity data is one area. And sort of my final snapshot, I'm going to talk a little bit about this area that we've recently gotten interested in, which is this idea of out-of-distribution generalization, which is a little bit more general. And this is an interesting topic because, as you might be familiar with, machine learning methods tend to work well when data is independent and identically distributed. So in all of the examples that we showed with the multi-res WNet performance, the data met these requirements. But in real-world applications, it's possible that this assumption could break down. So the data where we want to actually make predictions could be fundamentally different from the training data that we have available. And one would expect this would negatively affect the performance of a machine learning model. And you can imagine for the schematic relationship between data shown on this slide, the performance would be quite bad. So in some of our recent work, we've been considering the scenario where we have multiple training environments that are related but not identical to the test data environment that we ultimately care about. You can kind of see schematically what that means on this slide. And over the next like 2 or 3 slides, and then I'm done, I'm going to show a very abridged snapshot of the work that my student Ling Xiao, who's co-advised by Harold Park, has done to sort of more specifically define benchmark data sets in this area. So this slide right here shows an example data set that Ling Xiao prepared that captures something that we refer to as sampling bias, where we define a spurious feature, so one that doesn't have a stable correlation with the output distribution, and then make the data selection probability a function of the spurious feature that changes in each environment. So in this case, we make the spurious feature, this VI, sum of modulus, which is correlated with our output change in strain energy that we're focused on, but it's not perfectly correlated. And then we essentially apply this sort of background probability across each environment to make sort of this relationship vary in the different scenarios. So in this initial work, Ling Xiao decided to focus on a few different algorithms that have been used in the out-of-distribution generalization machine learning literature. For the most part, these problems have been applied to problems in classification, and to our knowledge, they haven't really been examined extensively in the context of mechanics problems. And without going into too much detail, really the important part is that they all have sort of these machine learning standard kind of loss functions as their first term. So this is an example without any special consideration. You see the first term in all of these equations matches, but then in all of the out-of-distribution generalization algorithms, we pick up a second term that essentially panelizes variation across the different training environments. And so if we actually take a look at how these algorithms do at out-of-distribution generalization, this is an example from a covariate shift problem, which is not the one that I showed on the previous slides, where the input distribution changes, but the output distribution remains the same. On the left plot, we show the performance in the training environment, and on the right plot, we show the performance in the testing environment. And we can see that all algorithms perform pretty similarly on the training environment, but when we take a look at the testing environment, we see that these kind of red and pink markers are below these black markers, which indicates that there's some benefit to using these out-of-distribution generalization examples. But if we take a look at this example right here, which is looking at the kind of sampling bias case that I showed before, you can see that these lines are all pretty much on top of each other. And in the sampling bias case, at least for problems in mechanics, these algorithms offer little to no benefit. And really just big picture, we're establishing these baselines to motivate future mechanics-specific or physics-informed out of distribution generalization algorithms with kind of validation that work across several open access data sets. And that's sort of the conclusion of this talk, a snapshot of a few different problems that we've been working on. And I'll skip through these slides super fast and just say that we have a bunch of other benchmark data sets and studies across these data sets that we're excited about. And if anybody is interested in contributing to this list of open access data sets, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you very much for listening.